The alarm bell did not sound like a bell. It sounded like a wound opening in the dark. I had stood the night post at the east gate of Harrowgate Palace for 11 years, and in 11 years I had learned the exact temperature of every hour. 2 o'clock in the morning has a stillness you can lean against. The cobblestones give back the day's heat through the soles of your boots long after the sun is gone, and the lamps along the forecourt throw a steady amber that never wavers unless the wind comes up off the river. I knew that stillness the way a man knows the breathing of someone he loves asleep beside him. So when the great brass bell in the North Tower began to hammer at 23 minutes past 2, I did not need to be told that something was wrong. I had already felt it, the way you feel a held breath in a room before anyone speaks. The bell only confirmed it. My name is Corvin Aldous. I'm a sergeant of the Queen's household guard, in service to Her Majesty Queen Saralind of the Royal House of Harrowgate, and on the night the palace came undone I was the man standing where the trouble first walked in. I do not say that to claim glory. I say it because everything that followed turned on small things that I happened to be in a position to notice, and a man should be honest about both his luck and his failures. I had my share of both that night. When the bell began, I did not run. A guard who runs at the first alarm is a guard who has already surrendered his judgment to his fear, and the post does not want your fear. It wants your eyes. So I held my ground at the gate as my orders required, and I made myself catalog what was true. The bell was the inner court alarm, not the perimeter, which meant whatever had triggered it was already inside the walls, not pressing at them. The forecourt lamps still burned, so the power had not been cut. No window above me had lit. The family's apartments in the south wing stayed dark, which meant the duty officer had not yet roused the household. And the wind was dead calm, so the smell that reached me a moment later, a thin, sour thread of smoke, the kind that comes from cloth and not from wood, had not blown in from the city. It had come from somewhere close. I keyed the wire at my collar. East Gate Aldous, inner alarm North Tower. I have smoke light close in, report. The voice that came back belonged to Pell, the night duty officer, and it was already running ahead of itself. All posts hold. We have a fire alert and a forced door in the East Service range. Hold your gates. Nobody in, nobody out. Do you hear me, Aldous? Nobody out. Nobody out. I marked that because it told me what Pell already believed. He believed someone was inside who should not be, and that this someone might try to leave. He was right to believe it, as it turned out. He was simply wrong about who, and wrong about how, and wrong most of all about why. But that is the nature of an alarm. It tells you that the house is afraid. It does not tell you what the house should be afraid of. That part you have to find for yourself, and most men, in the heat of the bell, never do. They take the first answer the night hands them, because the first answer lets them stop being afraid. I want to tell you about that night honestly, from the inside, because the version that the court settled on in the days afterward was tidy and wrong, and the truth was neither tidy nor comfortable, and it cost more than anyone wanted to pay. But the truth was owed. It was owed to a frightened old man who would otherwise have carried the blame to his grave. It was owed to 2 sleeping children in the south wing who never knew how near the danger had come. And it was owed to the Queen, who had taught every one of us, by her own example, that a thing being inconvenient was never a reason to leave it unsaid. So the smoke, the forced door, the bell still hammering overhead like a heart that has forgotten how to slow down. I did not leave my gate, not yet. Discipline is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling held in your 2 hands so that it does not spill and ruin the work. I wanted, more than I can tell you, to abandon the post and run toward the smoke. Instead, I did the harder thing. I stood, and I watched my sector, because that was where the breach might come, and I trusted my brothers on the inner posts to do their work as I did mine. That trust is the whole architecture of a household guard. Pull 1 stone and the arch falls. What I could see from the east gate was this: the long service range that ran from the kitchens to the old stables, a low building of gray stone with small barred windows, used for storage and the work of the day staff. One of those small windows, the third from the corner, was glowing, not the steady glow of a lamp left burning, the restless, breathing glow of a small fire. As I watched, a shape crossed in front of it, a man, hunched, moving fast, and then the glow guttered and dropped, as though someone had thrown a coat or a blanket over it. The smoke that had reached me thinned almost at once. That, I thought, is a man putting a fire out, not a man setting one. It is a small thing, that distinction. It is the kind of thing that does not survive the telling, because by morning the court would know only that there had been a fire and a forced door and a man in the service range, and the court would assemble those three facts into the obvious shape. An intruder had broken in and tried to burn the palace and been caught. That shape is clean. It has a villain and a crime and a rescue all in a row. The trouble is that it was not what happened, and I knew it was not what happened, because I had stood at my gate and watched a man put a fire out with his own coat at 2:30 in the morning, and you do not do that if you are the one who lit it. You do that if you have stumbled onto something burning and you are trying, in a panic, to stop it spreading before it kills you. I keyed the wire again. Pell, the fire in the service range is being smothered, not spread. Repeat, smothered. Whoever is in there is fighting it, not feeding it. Advise before your men go in hard. A pause, then Pell, tighter than before. Noted, hold your gate. Which is what an officer says when he has heard you and decided not to let it change anything. I did not blame him. He had a forced door, a fire, and a sleeping royal family in his care, and the textbook does not have a chapter on the man who smothers his own fire. The textbook says, secure the breach, take the intruder, protect the principals. Pell would do all three, and he would do them well, and at the end of it he would have a prisoner and a story, and the story would be wrong. I have thought in the years since about how easily it could have stayed wrong. If I had not had the east gate that night, if I had run when the bell rang, like a frightened man, and not stood and watched, if the third window from the corner had faced any other direction. A whole different version of that night sits just beside the real one, close enough to touch, in which a harmless old man hangs for a crime he did not commit, and the man who truly planned it walks free up the grand stair in a good coat, smiling for years. That version did not happen, but it was never far. It is never far. That is the thing they do not teach you at the gate, and it is the only thing worth learning. The truth is not loud. It does not announce itself with a bell. It waits, small and patient, for one man to refuse the easy answer long enough to find it. I refused it. That is the whole of what I did. The rest is only the cost of refusing. The bell stopped at 2:29. The silence it left behind was worse than the noise. In the quiet I could hear boots on the cobbles inside the inner court, many of them, moving with the heavy purpose of men who have been told what to do and are glad to be doing it. The night watch had mustered. Lamps that had been dark were lit one by one along the colonnade, and the long forecourt filled slowly with that uneasy half-light that comes before dawn or after a disaster, when nobody is sure yet which one they are living through. I stayed at my gate. From it I watched them bring the man out of the service range. There were 4 of them around him, and they had his arms pinned and his head down. The way you bring out a man you have decided is dangerous. But the man between them was not dangerous. I saw that at once, even at a distance, even in bad light, because I had been trained to read a body the way a scholar reads a page, and the body between the 4 guards was telling me a story that did not match the way they held it. He was old. His shoulders were rounded, not from menace, but from a lifetime of bending to work. His hands, when one of the guards yanked them up behind him, were thick and scarred and trembling, and they trembled in the particular way that an old man's hands tremble when he is frightened past the edge of what his heart can carry. He was not fighting. He was weeping. I could not hear it from the gate, but I could see the shape of it in the heave of his back, and a man does not weep like that when he has just tried to burn down a palace and been caught. He weeps like that when something terrible has happened to him, and no one will listen. I knew him. That was the thing that turned in me, cold and sharp. I knew the man. His name was Tomas Varin, and he was the underkeeper of the kitchen stores, an old soul who had served the household longer than I had been alive. He fed the gate cats. He kept a tin of barley sugar in his apron for the staff children on the days they were brought to work. Twice a year, on the Queen's birthday and on the anniversary of the late King's death, Tomas Varin laid a single sprig of rosemary on the old well in the kitchen yard, because, he had told me once, in his slow, careful way, rosemary was for remembrance, and a house that forgot its dead was a house with no foundation. That was the man they were marching across the forecourt with his arms wrenched up behind his back, weeping, while a young officer walked ahead of him already composing, I have no doubt, the sentence he would say to his superiors. "We have the intruder, sir. We took him in the act." I left my gate. I want to be precise about this, because it is the only order I broke that night, and a guard should account for the orders he breaks the way a man accounts for a debt. My standing order was to hold the east gate until relieved. I held it through the bell, through the smoke, through the muster, exactly as I should have. But when they brought Tomas Varin across the forecourt, I made a judgment that the post could be held for 90 seconds by the truth as well as by my body, and I stepped down from it and walked, not ran. I have never run on duty, and I did not start that night, to intercept the party as it reached the inner arch. "Officer," I said. The young man leading them turned. I did not know him well. He was a recent appointment to the night watch, eager and clean-jawed, the kind of officer who has read every regulation and met very little life. Lieutenant Hadwin, his name was. He looked at me the way an officer looks at a sergeant who has left his post, which is to say with the beginning of a reprimand already on his face. "Sergeant, you are not relieved. Return to your gate." "I will, sir, in a moment. I need you to hear one thing first while it can still do some good." I kept my voice level and low, the voice I use when a thing matters more than the man's pride, which is the voice that gives a man room to listen without losing face. I had eyes on the service range from the gate. The man you have did not set that fire. He was putting it out. I watched him smother it with his own coat. Whatever happened in there tonight, he walked into the middle of it. He is not your intruder. Hadwin's jaw tightened. Behind him, old Tomas had lifted his head at my voice, and the look he gave me, I have carried that look for years. It was not relief. It was past relief. It was the look of a drowning man who sees a rope and no longer believes that ropes are real. "Sergeant Aldous," Hadwin said, and I was a little surprised he knew my name. "We found this man inside a forced door with a fire burning at 2:30 in the morning with no leave to be in that building at this hour. The duty officer's orders are to secure all persons present. I am securing him. If he is innocent, that will come out in the questioning. It is not for you or for me to decide it on the forecourt." He was right. That is the maddening thing about Hadwin, and I have made my peace with it since. By the letter, he was entirely right. You do not exonerate a man on a hunch in the dark while a palace is in crisis. You secure everyone, you sort it out by daylight, you let the truth come at the speed the procedure allows. It is a good rule. It exists because guards who decide guilt and innocence by their own gut get it wrong, badly and often, and the rule is there to protect the very Tomas Varins of the world from a sergeant's mistaken certainty. I knew all that. I have taught it to younger men since. But I also knew what I had seen, and I knew Tomas, and I knew one more thing that Hadwin did not, which was this. The door to the service range was not the kind of door a panicked intruder forces on his way in. I had walked that range 100 times. The forced door, I could see it now, hanging on one hinge, lamplight spilling out of it, was an interior door, deep inside the building, far from any window or wall a man would breach to get in from outside. You do not force a door that deep into a building unless you are already inside it and trying to get further in, or trying to get out a way you came in by. The geography was wrong for the story Hadwin was telling himself. The intruder had not broken in through that door. The intruder had come in some other way, gone deep, and forced that door from the inside, and old Tomas, who slept in a little room off the kitchen stores because his cottage in the town was too far for a man with his knees, had woken to the noise and gone to see, and found a fire and tried to put it out and been caught standing over it like a fool. At least, I said, look at his hands before you decide what they did. Hadwin paused. To his credit, and I want his credit recorded, because the easy thing for him would have been to brush past me and be done, he paused. He looked down at Tomas Varen's hands, still wrenched up behind the old man's back, and even a clean-jawed lieutenant who had read every regulation and met very little life could see what was on them. Soot, yes. But also burns. Fresh, red, blistering burns across both palms and the pads of the fingers. The burns of a man who has beaten at flames with his bare hands because he had nothing else and no time to find it. A man who lights a fire, I said quietly, does not burn his palms putting it out. Those are not an arsonist's hands, sir. Those are the hands of the man who saved your service range. For a long moment Hadwin said nothing. The forecourt held its breath around us, and in that breath I understood with a sinking clarity that I had just made myself a problem. Because if old Tomas had not set the fire, then someone else had, someone who had come into the palace another way, gone deep, and done a thing in the dark that the bell had interrupted. And that someone was either still inside these walls, or had gone back out through whatever gap he had come in by, while every guard in the house stood watching an innocent old man weep on the cobbles. Hadwin was not a fool. I saw the thought reach him, and I saw him hate it. He straightened, and his voice when it came was quieter, the bluster gone out of it. Return to your gate, Sergeant. I will note your observation in my report. The man will be held, but he will be held gently, and a surgeon will see to his hands. That is all I can promise you on the forecourt. He hesitated, then added, in a lower register meant only for me. If you are right, then we have a worse problem than an old man. So I hope for all our sakes that you are wrong. So do I, sir, I said, and I meant it. But I did not believe it. I went back to my gate. The order had been just, and I obeyed it, and I stood the rest of the night out where I belonged. But a man's body can hold a post while his mind walks the whole length of a problem, and mine walked it 100 times before dawn. The geography, the forced interior door, the burned hands, the fire that was being smothered, not fed. And one more thing, the smallest of all, the thing I had seen and not understood and could not let go of. When the 4 guards brought Tomas out, the old man had been clutching something in one ruined hand, and a guard had struck it loose, and it had fallen on the cobbles with a small bright sound, metal on stone. In the rush nobody had bent to pick it up. I had seen where it fell. And as the gray light came up over the river and the forecourt slowly emptied, I marked the spot the way you mark a grave, so that I could find it again. It was a key. By the time the sun was fully up, the palace had decided what had happened, and once a palace decides a thing, it is very hard to make it decide otherwise. The story that hardened in those first hours was the clean one, the one with a villain and a crime and a rescue in a row, and it went like this. An intruder, a thief perhaps, or a madman had broken into the service range in the night, had set a fire to cover his work or for the pure malice of it, and had been caught and taken by the swift action of the night watch before he could reach the family's wing. The household was safe. The watch had performed admirably. The queen and the young prince and princess had slept through the whole affair and would wake to a palace already secured. It was, the senior staff agreed, a frightening thing, but a thing well handled, and the proper lesson was that the watch must be reinforced and the old service range better locked. There was only one inconvenience in this story, and the inconvenience was Tomas Varen, because Tomas was not an intruder. Tomas was a servant of 40 years standing whom half the household knew by name, and you cannot easily call such a man a thief and a madman and have anyone believe it. So the story bent, the way stories bend to keep their shape, and by mid-morning it had bent into something crueler and more plausible. The old man had done it himself, grown strange in his age, perhaps, resentful of some slight, careless with a lamp among the dry stores, and then, too proud or too frightened to raise the alarm, had tried to hide his mistake and been caught. It explained the burned hands. He had caused the fire and then panicked. It explained why he was there, he slept there. It explained everything, and it required no intruder at all, which meant it required no breach in the palace's defenses, which meant it required no one to admit that the walls had been gotten past. That last part was the heart of it, though no one said so aloud. A palace that has caught an old servant being careless is a palace that is safe. A palace that has been entered deep in the night by a person unknown who is still at large, that is a palace that must look hard at itself, and there are men inside every great house who will pay almost anything to avoid that particular looking. I did not have the standing to fight the story. I was a sergeant of the night watch. My word had weighed at the gate and nowhere above it. When I came off duty at the change, gray-eyed and aching, I wrote my report exactly as I had seen things: the smothered fire, the burned hands, the forced interior door, the geography that did not fit, and I handed it up through Pell, and I watched it disappear into the machinery of the house the way a stone disappears into a deep well, with a small sound and then nothing. Hadwin, to his word, had noted my observation in his own report. It made no difference. The story had already chosen its shape. My report and his note became two awkward facts that the story simply flowed around, the way a river flows around a rock and closes seamless on the other side. But I had seen where the key fell, and before I left the forecourt that morning, while the day staff were beginning their work and no one was watching a tired sergeant cross the cobbles toward the change house, I walked the long way round, and I stopped, and I bent as though to retie a bootlace, and I picked up the small bright thing from the gutter where it had lain all night, and I closed my white glove around it and put it in my coat. It was a key, as I had thought, but it was not Tomas Varen's key. I knew that at once in my palm before I had even looked at it. Tomas's keys, the keys of the underkeeper of the kitchen stores, were old iron, worn smooth, dark with age and grease, hung on a great ring he carried on his belt and rattled when he walked. This key was small and bright and new. It was brass, freshly cut, the burr still on its edge where it had come off the cutter's wheel, and it was the wrong shape entirely for any storeroom or cellar door. It was a fine, precise, complicated key, the kind that fits a fine, precise, complicated lock, the kind of lock you find not on a larder but on a strongbox, a cabinet of documents, a vault, the kind of lock that guards not bread and barley but secrets. I stood in the gray morning with that key in my glove, and I felt the night rearrange itself behind my eyes. Tomas Varen had been holding this when they took him, not his own iron ring that still hung at his belt. I had seen it. This bright new brass key in his burned hand, clutched as though it were the only true thing in a world gone mad, and it could mean only one of two things. Either Tomas had cut this key himself, secretly, to open a lock he had no business opening, and I did not believe that, not of Tomas, not for a moment, but I made myself hold the possibility, because a man who only believes what he wants to believe is no use to the truth. Or, and this was the thing that made the morning go cold around me, Tomas had found it. Had picked it up off the floor of the service range, the way I had picked it off the gutter, because it did not belong there, and his careful old eyes had caught it gleaming where it should not be, and he had closed his hand around it an instant before the guards seized him, perhaps without even knowing why, the way an honest man's hand closes around evidence of a thing gone wrong. A freshly cut brass key, dropped in the service range, on the night a fire was set and an old man was blamed. Someone had been in that building who carried keys he had made in secret. Someone who had gone deep into the part of the range that connected, I knew the plans. A guard learns the bones of the house he keeps, to the old disused passage that ran beneath the east court toward the heart of the palace, toward the strong rooms, toward the muniment cabinets where the crown kept its papers. The fire had not been the crime. The fire had been the accident or the cover or the panic. The crime was something else, and it had a key, and the key was in my glove, and I was the only living soul who knew it existed. I should have taken it straight up the chain. I want to be honest that I considered it standing there, and that I did not do it, and that my not doing it was a choice and not an accident. I did not take it up the chain because the chain had already chosen its story, and a key that contradicted the story would meet the same deep well my report had met, and worse, it would warn whoever had cut it that someone had found it. So I kept it. I kept it, and I went home to my narrow room above the saddlers in the town, and I did not sleep, and I began, that morning, the quiet work that would take me the better part of a month and very nearly take everything else. A man who has never tried it does not know how hard it is to be patient when you are right. The hardest discipline I have ever kept was not standing motionless through a winter night, nor holding my hand from a sword when a fool spat at the gate. The hardest discipline of my life was the next 4 weeks, when I knew a thing that mattered and could not say it, could only gather slowly in silence, the small true facts that would one day let me say it and be believed. Restraint is not weakness. I have heard soft men call it weakness, as though the loud thing and the strong thing were the same. They are not. A bell is loud and a bell is helpless. It can only ring and tell the house to be afraid. Restraint is what comes after the bell, the cold, slow, unglamorous work of finding out what the house should actually do. I had spent 11 years learning to hold still. Now I learned what the stillness was for. I began with what I could find out without being seen to look, because to be seen looking was to warn the man I was looking for. And the first thing I needed to know was simple and terrible: what had happened to Tomas. They held him in the old gatehouse cell, which is not a true prison but a holding room with a barred door, used in better days for the occasional drunk delivery man or the rare cutpurse caught in the crowd at a public day. A surgeon had seen to his hands, as Hadwin had promised. That promise at least was kept, and his palms were salved and wrapped, though the burns would scar him for what years he had left. He was charged with nothing yet. The house was deciding what to charge him with, which is the most frightening state a man can be held in, because a charge can at least be answered, but a deciding cannot. I went to see him on my second evening off, on the pretext of returning a tin of barley sugar that I said I had found in the kitchen yard, which was a lie, but a kind one. The guard on the cell knew me, and let me sit with him a quarter hour. He had aged a year for every day. That is the thing the clean story never counts, what it costs the one who is fed to it. Tomas Varin had served the house since he was a boy of 9, carrying coal, and the house was the whole of his life and his loyalty and his pride, and the house had decided, with no malice in particular, only the cold convenience of men who needed a tidy answer, that he was a careless old fool who had nearly burned it down. He did not weep when I sat with him. He had wept himself out. He sat with his bandaged hands in his lap, and he said to me, in his slow, careful way, "Sergeant, I have laid the rosemary on the well for the old king 11 years now. Will they let me lay it this year, do you think? It falls on the 9th. I would not like the well to go bare." And I had to turn my face away, because a man who is afraid for the king's memorial rosemary while the house prepares to brand him, a criminal is not a man capable of the thing they accuse him of, and the injustice of it sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. I asked him gently what he had seen that night, and here is what he told me, slow and exact, an old man who had spent 40 years getting small things right. He had woken, he said, to a sound that was wrong. Not the fire came after. First there was a sound deep in the building, past the dry stores, in the long shut passage that the staff called the cold corridor because it had not been used in his lifetime and the damp came off its stones. A scrape, he said. Stone on stone. And then a step that was trying to be quiet and failing, because the cold corridor's floor was loose and shifting, and no man who did not know it could cross it without waking the slabs. Tomas knew it. He had crossed it as a boy, fetching things from the deep cellars before they were sealed. So he had got up in his nightshirt with a single candle, because 40 years of service had taught him that a wrong sound in the night is a thing the underkeeper goes to see about and does not leave for someone else. And in the dark of the dry stores he had found a door standing open that was always locked, the door to the cold corridor, and beyond it, a faint glow and the smell of smoke, and on the floor just inside the open door, gleaming in his candlelight, a small bright key that did not belong to him or to any lock he kept. He had picked it up. He could not say why. His hand had simply closed on it, the way a careful man's hand closes on a thing out of place. And then he had seen the fire, a heap of papers and cloth alight in an alcove of the cold corridor, set against the old dry beams, where in an hour it would have caught the whole range and perhaps more. And he had not stopped to think. He had beaten at it with his hands and then smothered it with his own coat, an old man alone in his nightshirt fighting a fire in the dark. And that was how the watch had found him, weeping over the saved beams with a stranger's key clutched in his burning hand. "Did you see the man?" I asked him. "The one who made the fire, the one who came down the cold corridor?" He shook his head and his eyes filled, not for himself this time. "There was a shadow," he said. "When I came through the door there was a shadow going away from me up the corridor toward the deep part, toward the old stair. A man's shape, tall, a long coat, I think the skirts of it moved. But the candle was small and my eyes are old and the fire took all my mind in a moment. I am sorry, Sergeant, I have failed at the one thing. I cannot tell you his face." He looked at his bandaged hands. "I should have run after him, but there was the fire and the beams and the house above us all asleep. I could not leave it to chase a shadow, so I let him go and I saved the house, and the house will hang me for it." He said this last without bitterness, which was the worst of all. He said it the way an old man states the weather. I left him that evening with 3 things I had not had before. I had a direction up the cold corridor, toward the deep part, toward the old stair, which I knew on the plans ran up toward the muniment range and the strong rooms. I had a description, thin as it was, a tall man, a long coat, a man who knew the house well enough to come at night with a cut key, but not well enough to know that the cold corridor's loose slabs would wake the underkeeper. And I had a certainty that no court had granted me and no chain of command would ratify, that Tomas Varin was innocent, that a tall man in a long coat had come into the heart of the palace in the dark, that he had set a fire to destroy something, I thought, not to burn the house. A small fire in a sealed corridor is not how you burn a palace. It is how you turn papers to ash, and that he had dropped, in his haste when the old man's candle came, a freshly cut brass key that now lay in my coat. I walked home along the river in the dark, and I let myself, for the length of that walk, feel the size of the thing. A man had come for the crown's papers. He had keys cut to fit locks he had no right to. He knew the deep bones of the palace. He had been frightened off before he finished, and he had left a frightened old man to take the blame. And the house, the whole great careful house of the royal Harrowgates, which I had given my life to keep, had taken the blame and thanked itself for its diligence. The truth was small and it was patient and it was entirely mine, and I was a sergeant of the night watch with a stranger's key in his pocket and no one above him who wished to hear it. I understood, by the time I reached the saddler's door, what I was going to have to do. I was going to have to find the man myself, alone, in the silence, and bring the house a truth so complete and so undeniable that even a story already chosen would have to break against it. And I understood, too, that if I were wrong, if I had misread a hand, a door, a shadow, I would end my service in disgrace, and old Tomas would hang anyway, and the man in the long coat would come again, on a darker night, for something worse than papers. The cold corridor was sealed again by then, of course. After the fire, the duty officer had ordered the service range secured, the forced doors mended, the cold corridor's far end bricked where the old stair began. The house had closed the wound without examining it, which is what houses do. But a guard who has kept a place for 11 years carries a key map in his head that no plan on paper holds, and I knew that the cold corridor could be reached not only from the dry stores, but from a low door in the kitchen yard that the day staff used for ash and refuse. a door so humble that no one had thought to brick it. On my next night off, I had arranged, by trading shifts, to be off the gate 2 nights of every 3, which was its own small risk, for a sergeant who suddenly wants his evenings free invites the question of why. I went down to the kitchen yard in the dark, in plain clothes, with a shuttered lantern, and I let myself into the cold corridor by the ash door, and I went to the place where Tomas had fought the fire. The alcove was black with soot, but the fire had been small and well smothered, and there was a great deal left to read. I am not a clever man in the way that scholars are clever, but I have spent my life reading scenes, the angle of a fallen man, the direction of a scuffed cobble, and a scene is a kind of sentence if you have the patience to parse it. So I parsed the alcove. The fire had been built against the old dry beams, yes, but it had been built on a heap, and the heap had been papers. I sifted the cold ash with my gloved fingers and found, here and there, a scrap that had not burned through, a corner, an edge, a few words in the formal hand of a palace clerk. The papers had not been random. They were documents. And from the few words I could read on the unburned corners, a phrase here about lands and tithes, a half line there about the disbursement of the household treasury, a single surviving word, accounts in a clerk's careful copperplate, I understood what kind of documents they had been. They were not state secrets in the spy's sense, not maps of armies or letters between kings. They were the dull, deadly, unglamorous papers of money, records, ledgers. The accounts of how the crown's wealth came in and where it went out. And then I understood the shape of the whole crime, and it was so much smaller and so much worse than the clean story the palace had told itself. No foreign agent had come for state secrets. No madman had come to burn the house. A man had come in the night, with keys cut to fit the muniment cabinets, to take certain account books and burn them in a sealed corridor where the fire would do its work unseen until morning, when the ash would be cold, and the books would be gone, and no one would ever again be able to prove what those books had once recorded. He had come not to steal the crown's wealth in a single night. That is a thief's crime, loud and quickly caught, but to erase the record of a theft already long in progress. The fire was not an attack on the palace. It was a confession being burned, and the man who needed those particular books gone was not an intruder at all, not truly, because an intruder cannot get keys cut to the muniment locks. Those keys are held by very few. To cut a copy of one in secret, you must first have had the true key in your hand. You must be, or must be close to, a man the crown trusts with its accounts. I sat back on my heels in the cold dark with the soot on my gloves, and I felt the floor of the thing drop away beneath me. This was not a crime from outside the house. It was a crime from inside it, by someone the house trusted, and the reason the clean story had hardened so fast, and the reason my report had vanished down a deep well was not, perhaps, only the natural laziness of frightened men. It might be that someone with weight in the house had wanted the clean story to harden. Someone who knew exactly what had burned in the cold corridor, and exactly why an old man taking the blame was the most convenient outcome the night could possibly have produced. I will not pretend I knew that night in the ash who the man was. I did not. I knew only what he must be close to the accounts, trusted with keys, tall, a wearer of long coats, knowledgeable of the deep house, and I knew that I had now, for the first time, the beginning of a way to find him, because a man who needs particular account books burned is a man with something in those books to hide, and a theft long in progress leaves a track in the very records the thief is trying to destroy. He cannot burn every copy. The crown's accounts are kept in more than one form, in more than one place, by more than one hand, a clerk's daybook here, a treasurer's summary there, a steward's tally of stores, an auditor's annual reckoning. The man in the long coat had burned the muniment ledgers, the central record. But the central record is built up from 100 smaller ones, and those smaller ones were scattered through the offices of the household, in the keeping of clerks and underclerks and storekeepers who had no idea that the figures they copied so faithfully were the threads that would one day hang the man who had used them. I needed those threads, and to get at them, a sergeant of the night watch, who has no more business in the household accounts office than a fish has in a forge, would need a reason to be there, and a friend inside it, and a great deal more patience than I had ever in my life been asked for. I found my friend the next week, and I want to put his name in this account because he risked as much as I did and asked for nothing, and the truth is owed to him as much as to anyone. His name was Edred Mott. He was the assistant to the household auditor, a small, dry, precise man of perhaps 60, with ink on his fingers and a back bent from a lifetime over ledgers, and he had two qualities that made him exactly the man I needed and would never have guessed it. He loved the accounts the way Tomas loved the well, with a craftsman's pure and useless love of a thing done right, and he had been quietly for months, troubled by figures that would not reconcile. He had said nothing. A man in Edred Mott's position does not raise his voice about figures that will not reconcile, because the figures that will not reconcile are someone's responsibility, and that someone is always above you, and the assistant to the auditor who points up the ladder is the assistant to the auditor no longer. So he had carried it, the way I had carried the key, in silence, hoping someone with more weight would see what he saw. And when a night watch sergeant came to him, on a careful pretext, and began to ask gently, sideways, the way you ask a frightened man about the household accounts and the muniment ledgers and whether everything there was as it should be, Edred Mott looked at me over his spectacles for a long, long moment, and then he closed the office door, and he said in his small, dry voice, "Sergeant, I have been waiting 2 years for someone to ask me that question. Sit down." What Edred Mott showed me over the next weeks, in the locked office in the small dead hours when the household slept, was a thing more patient and more sinister than any single night's burglary. He spread his day books across the table under his green-shaded lamp, and he laid his ink-stained finger on figure after figure, and he taught me, slowly, to see the pattern that had haunted him for 2 years, and that he had not dared to name. It was not a theft you could point at. That was its cunning. No great sum had ever vanished in a single line. Instead, all through the household accounts, in 100 places, the money leaked. A contract for the palace's coal was let at a price a little higher than the coal was worth, and the difference went somewhere. A grant of repair to the river wall was paid for twice. Once to the masons who did the work, once again, on a second warrant, to a company whose name appeared nowhere else, and which seemed to have no masons and no wall. A charitable disbursement to a foundling house in the southern town went out faithfully every quarter, a sum the good queen had ordered in her own hand for the care of orphan children, and the foundling house, Edred had quietly written to its keeper on a pretext, had never received above 1/10 of it. "The queen believes she is feeding 50 children," Edred said, and his dry voice cracked on it for the first and only time. "She is feeding 5. The rest goes into the dark." He had folded the keeper's letter very small and hidden it in the spine of a ledger, because to be found with it was to be the next old man weeping on the cobbles. A little here, a little there. Coal and walls and foundling children and a score of other small wrong figures, none large enough to draw the eye, all flowing, when you stood back and let your eye go soft, in one direction, toward a set of warrants and contracts and disbursements that all passed, at one point or another, through a single office and a single signature. The crown's wealth was being bled slowly, over years, by a man who had made himself the channel through which it ran, and who had grown so confident in the smallness of each wrong figure that he had not reckoned on a dry, precise auditor's assistant, who loved the accounts too much to let them lie, nor on a night-watch sergeant who would not take the easy answer the bell had handed him. I asked Edred the question I had been circling for an hour. Whose office, whose signature? He did not answer at once. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them with great care, which I had learned was the thing he did when he was frightened, and he put them back on, and he looked at me, and he said a name. I will not pretend I felt triumph. I felt the floor go out from under me a second time, worse than in the ash, because the name Edred Mott spoke was not the name of some minor clerk I could have brought down with a sergeant's word. It was the name of the Lord Treasurer of the household, Master Fairham Vane, keeper of the crown's coffers, one of the 3 or 4 most powerful men in the palace, a man who dined with the Prince-Consort, who advised the Queen on the realm's money, who held in his own keeping the master keys to the muniment cabinets and the strong rooms, and who was tall, and favored a long dark coat, and knew the deep bones of the palace as a man knows the rooms of his own house. I sat with that name in the lamplight, and I understood, all at once, every part of the night. Why the fire had been set in the cold corridor, to burn the muniment ledgers, the one central record that, read against Edred's daybooks, would prove the slow theft beyond any denial. Why the man had had keys to locks no intruder could reach, because he had not needed to cut them in secret at all. He had needed only to lose one in his haste, when an old man's candle came around the door. Why the clean story had hardened so fast and my report had vanished. Because the Lord Treasurer of the household had weight enough to bend the deciding of the house, and an old storekeeper taking the blame was the most convenient outcome the night could have produced, exactly as I had feared, only worse, because it was no accident of frightened men, but the deliberate work of the very man who had set the fire. And why Thomas Varin, who had saved the house, would hang for it if no one stopped it, because a Lord Treasurer's word weighed more than a storekeeper's life, and the dead tell no figures. "He is too high, Sergeant," Edred said, very quietly watching my face. "Do you understand me? He is too high. I have these daybooks, and they are true, and they are not enough. He will say they are mistaken, or that I am, or that an assistant auditor with a grievance has cooked them. The muniment ledgers that would have proved them against him are ash in the cold corridor. He saw to that. We have a pattern, and a pattern is not a proof. We have a name, and a name against the Lord Treasurer is a thing that gets the man who speaks it dismissed, ruined, perhaps charged himself. I have carried this 2 years precisely because I could see no end to it that did not end with me on the cobbles instead of the figures put right. Now you have come, and I am glad, and I am also more afraid than I was, because 2 men who know a dangerous thing are in twice the danger of one." He folded his hands. "So tell me, Sergeant Aldous, since you have asked the question I could not, what do we do with the answer?" It was the right question, and I did not have a ready answer, and I told him so. But I had by then the key. I drew it out of my coat and laid it on the table among his day books, the small bright brass key, and I watched the auditor's assistant go very still. "That," I said, "is what Thomas Varin was holding when they took him. It is a key cut to the muniment cabinets. You will know its shape better than I. It was dropped in the cold corridor on the night of the fire by the man who said it, and it is the one thing he does not know exists. He believes he got clean away with a lost shadow and a burned record and an old man to blame. He does not know that the old man's hand closed on his key, or that the key is now on this table." I let that sit. "A pattern is not a proof," you said. "A name against a Lord Treasurer gets the speaker ruined. All true, but a freshly cut copy of the muniment key, in the keeping of a man who has no right to such a key, and every reason to want the muniment ledgers burned, that is not a pattern, Master Mott. That is a thing he held in his own hand. And if I can show, beyond denying, that this key is his, that he had it cut, that it fits the cabinets he claims only he can open, that it was in the corridor where the ledgers that would have hanged him went to ash, then your pattern stops being a story I cannot prove, and starts being the answer to a question only he can have left lying on that floor." Edred Mott looked at the key for a long time. Then he looked at me, and something settled in his dry old face, a kind of grim relief, the relief of a man who has carried a stone alone for 2 years and has at last found someone willing to carry the other end of it, knowing full well it might crush them both. "Then we must learn," he said, "where that key was cut. A brass key with the burr still on it was cut recently by a locksmith in this town or near it. The Lord Treasurer did not cut it himself. Great men do not stand at a cutter's wheel. He sent someone or went disguised, but a key like that fits a lock like the muniment cabinets, and a locksmith who cuts a key to a lock he has never seen must have had the pattern brought to him. a wax impression, a drawing, the true key itself for an hour. Find the locksmith, Sergeant, and you find the link from the key to the man. That is the thread. Pull it gently. Pull it wrong and he will feel it, and then God help us both and the old man and the 50 children who are 5. There are not many locksmiths in our town who can cut a key as fine as the one in my coat. A simple house key any tinker can copy, but the muniment cabinets were warded locks of an old and intricate make, and to cut a key that would turn them you needed a master's hands and a master's tools. I knew of 3 such men within a day's ride. I went to them as a private citizen, in plain clothes, on my own time, with the brass key wrapped in a scrap of leather, and to each I told the same careful half-truth, that I had found this key among a dead uncle's things, that I did not know what it opened, and that I wished to know whether such a key was a common make or a rare one, and whether the man might recognize his own work. It is a strange thing to ask, and 2 of the 3 looked at the key and shook their heads and named it the work of a finer hand than theirs and sent me on. The 3rd did not shake his head. The 3rd was an old man named Garrick Stole, whose shop stood in a narrow lane behind the corn market, and who had cut locks for the great houses of 3 counties in his long life. He took my brass key, and he turned it under his lamp, and his face changed, and I knew before he spoke that I had found my locksmith. But what he said was not what I had braced for, and it was here that the whole shape of the thing turned a second time and became something I had not foreseen. "I cut this," he said slowly. "I cut this not 3 weeks since, but I will tell you plain, friend, I did not like the cutting of it, and I have thought of it many nights since, and I am glad and sorry both to have you here asking." He set the key down. "A man came to me, not your uncle, no dead man, a living one and a gentleman by his coat, though he tried to dress it down. He brought me a pattern in wax, a clean impression of a warded key of this old make, and he asked me to cut it true, and he paid me 3 times the worth of it to ask no questions and to forget I had done it. I did not like it. A man who pays triple to be forgot is a man cutting a key to a lock that is not his. But I am old and I have a granddaughter to keep, and the money was real, and I told myself it was only brass and not my sin to wonder what it turned. He looked at me with the particular shame of a decent man who has done a small wrong for a real reason. I cut it. And now you are here with it found among a dead uncle's things, which I do not for one moment believe, and so I will ask you the question I should have asked him. What does it open, and what was done with it?" I made a decision then, looking at old Garrick Stole's troubled, honest face, and it was a risk, and I have never been sorry for it. I told him a portion of the truth, not the name, not yet, but enough. I told him the key had opened a lock it had no right to, in a great house, on a night when a fire was set and an innocent old man was blamed, and that I was trying to put it right and could not do it without him. And Garrick Stole, who had a granddaughter to keep and a small wrong on his conscience, did the thing that decent men do when at last they are asked plainly. He chose the harder right over the easier quiet. "Then I will tell you what I can swear to," he said. "I can swear I cut this key from a wax pattern brought by a gentleman 3 weeks gone. I can describe him tall, a long dark coat, a soft voice, a gold ring on his left hand with a green stone, a manner like a man used to being obeyed. And I kept the wax." He went to the back of his shop and rummaged in a drawer and brought out a small block of wax, and I saw that it bore, pressed deep and clean, the impression of a warded key, the master pattern from which my brass key had been cut. I keep the patterns of every key I cut, friend. A locksmith's habit. I never thought to be glad of it before tonight. I walked out of Garrick Stole's shop with 3 new things, and each of them changed the size of the danger. I had a witness, a respected master locksmith who could swear, before the crown itself, that he had cut my brass key from a pattern brought by a tall man in a long dark coat with a green-stoned ring. I had the wax physical proof linking the cut key to its master pattern, a thing no denial could argue away. And I had a description with a detail in it, a gold ring with a green stone on the left hand. That ring was the kind of thing a man wore without thinking, the kind of thing 50 courtiers might have seen on the Lord Treasurer's hand 100 times and never marked. But once you knew to look for it, it was a brand. That was the good of it. Here was the turn that made my blood run cold, and it came to me on the walk home, in the cold, clear way the worst understandings always come. Garrick Stoll had cut the key 3 weeks before the fire. 3 weeks. A man does not have a muniment key cut 3 weeks in advance to burn a record on a sudden impulse. The fire in the cold corridor was not a thing decided in panic on the night. It had been planned carefully for weeks, the key cut, the route learned, the night chosen. And if the Lord Treasurer had been planning for weeks to burn the central record of his theft, then something had changed 3 weeks ago to make him need it gone. Something had frightened him. Edred Mott's quiet 2-year unease had not frightened him. He did not know of it. Something else. Some event 3 weeks before the fire had told Faramond Vane that his slow theft was about to be found out by daylight, in the proper way, by the proper people. And his answer had been to burn the proof and plan to blame whoever the night delivered. I stopped in the dark street and made myself think it through, and when I had thought it through, I was more afraid than I had been at any point yet, because the only thing that could have frightened a Lord Treasurer into burning the Crown's own ledgers was the approach of an honest audit, a reckoning ordered from above him. And there was only one place above the Lord Treasurer of the household from which such a reckoning could be ordered. The Queen, or the man who, in matters of the household and the children and the running of the palace, acted as the Queen's own hand and second self, the Prince-Consort Aldric. Someone at the very top had set in motion, 3 weeks before the fire, a true examination of the Crown's accounts, and Faramond Vane had learned of it, and had moved to destroy the evidence before the examination could reach it, which meant the danger in the house was not finished and not contained. It meant that a man with everything to lose, who had already set a fire and framed an innocent and very nearly succeeded, knew that an honest reckoning was still coming, and would do whatever a cornered, powerful man does when the thing he has built his life on top of begins to crack beneath him. I felt the cornering reach me within the week. It began as such things always begin, with nothing you could point to. A shift I had traded for was suddenly untraded, by an order I could not trace, putting me back on the gate every night and stripping me of the free evenings I had so carefully won. Then a word from the watch captain, kindly meant on its face, that I had been seen about the town in plain clothes asking odd questions, and that a sergeant of the household guard ought to mind that his off-duty conduct gave no cause for talk. Then, and this was the one that told me he knew, or near enough, a quiet summons to the office of the household steward, a man named Lorick who answered to the Lord Treasurer, where I was asked, with great courtesy, and over a cup of good wine I did not drink, whether I was content in my post, whether I had thought of advancement, whether a man of my long service and evident sharpness might not be better used in some quieter, better-paid position away from the cold of the gate, in the southern town. Perhaps, the steward suggested, where the air was kinder to a man's knees. It was a bribe and a banishment in one, dressed as a kindness, and I understood it perfectly. Faramond Vane had felt the thread move. He did not yet know how much I had, he could not, or I would not have been offered a comfortable exile but given a hard one. But he knew that the night watch sergeant who had argued for the old man on the forecourt was still, weeks later, turning over the night, and he wanted that sergeant somewhere far away and well paid to stop. I thanked the steward for his consideration, and said I was content at the gate and loved the cold, and I watched the steward smile thin, and I left knowing that the next offer would not be a comfortable one. I want to set down here the cost of those days, because the cost is the truest part of the story, and the part the clean version never counts. I was a single man, with no wife to be made a widow and no children to be left fatherless, and I have thought since that this is why the duty fell to me and not to a better man, because I was the one with the least to lose, and the truth, when no one with power wants it told, falls always to the one with the least to lose. But I was not without things to lose. I had my post, which was the whole of my pride and the better part of my life. I had my honor, which a charge cleverly laid could blacken past cleaning. And I had, I will confess it, my fear, which I had to carry to the gate each night and stand still beneath while the dark pressed in, and I wondered whether the next shadow crossing the forecourt was a tall man in a long coat come to make sure the inconvenient sergeant met an accident in the night. A man who tells you he felt no fear in such days is a man who was not really in them. I felt it. The discipline was never in not feeling it. The discipline was in standing my post anyway, and keeping the key sewn now into the lining of my own coat where no search of my room would find it, and saying nothing, and waiting, and gathering, while the man above me grew daily more certain that he had me beaten. And then for a few days it looked as though he had. I had thought in my pride that I would carry the whole proof to the top myself, to the Prince-Consort, since it was he, I had reasoned, who must have ordered the honest audit that frightened Vane, and so it was he who would want the truth. But a sergeant does not walk up to the Prince-Consort of the realm. There is a wall of secretaries and chamberlains and stewards between the gate and the throne, and every one of them I might reach to ask an audience was a man who answered, somewhere up his ladder, to the Lord Treasurer. I tried, carefully, twice. The first request, sent up through the channel I judged cleanest, came back refused with a coldness that told me it had been read by the wrong eyes. The second never came back at all. And on the morning after the second, Edred Mott did not come to the audit office. I went, sick with dread, to find out why, and learned that the assistant to the household auditor had been dismissed the previous evening, quietly, with a small pension and no reason given, for the good of the office, and had been seen leaving the palace at dusk with his life's belongings in 2 boxes on a handcart. An old man turned out after a lifetime over the ledgers because he had loved them too well. That was the false dawn turned to its opposite, the moment the trap drew tight and the easy wrong path opened wide and inviting before me. Because here is what the dismissal of Edred Mott did, and it was a cleverer stroke than the fire. It removed the one man who could read the day books and swear to the pattern. It frightened every other clerk in the household into silence, for if the assistant auditor could be turned out for the good of the office, so could they. And it sent me, the night watch sergeant, a message as plain as a blow: I see your friends. I can ruin them with a word and give no reason, and no one will lift a hand, because that is what power is. You are next, and there will be no pension for you. Stop. And I will tell you honestly that I came near to stopping. Not from fear of ruin, I had made my peace with ruin. I came near to stopping from a worse temptation, the reasonable, sensible, decent-seeming temptation that is the real killer of truths. The temptation was this, that I had perhaps done enough. Thomas Varin had not yet been charged. The fire was weeks past, and the house had begun, in the way of houses, to forget it. The talk had moved on. Perhaps, I told myself, if I simply waited, the matter against Thomas would quietly die for want of anyone troubling to push it, and the old man would be let go, scarred but living, and I would have saved him without ever having to throw myself and Edred and Garrick Stole against a man too high to fall. Perhaps the wise thing, the proportionate thing, the thing a sensible man would do, was to secure the small good I could secure, the old man's life, and let the great wrong go, because the great wrong was the Lord Treasurer's to answer to God for, and not a sergeant's to die for. Was it not enough to save the innocent man? Did I have to bring down the guilty one? Was that not pride dressed as duty? I sat with that temptation a whole night on the gate, and it is the closest I ever came to failing. It was so reasonable. That is what made it deadly. The wrong path in such matters never looks like cowardice. It looks like wisdom. It always offers you a smaller good as the price of abandoning a greater one, and it tells you in your own sensible voice that the smaller good is all you can realistically hold. What broke the temptation was not a grand thought. It was a small one, and it came near dawn. I thought of the foundling house in the southern town, and of 50 children the Queen believed she was feeding who were 5, and of the simple fact that even if I saved Thomas and walked away, Faram Vane would still be there at the heart of the house, his theft buried under the ash he had made, free to go on bleeding the crown and starving the orphans, and to set, on some future night, some future fire, with some future old man to take the blame. Saving Tomas and stopping there was not securing a smaller good. It was leaving a wolf in the fold and calling it peace, because I had pulled one lamb out of his mouth. The queen had ordered 50 children fed because she was good, and her goodness was being made a thief's mask, and a guard who kept her gate and let that stand was no guard at all, only a uniform on a stand. So I did not stop. I finished the night, and I came off the gate, and I went looking, not for a way to reach the Prince-Consort through the wall of men who served the treasurer, for that wall had beaten me twice, but for the one path Faram Vane could not block, because it was the one path he did not know I had. The path was the children. I should explain, for this is the heart of how it was done, and it turned on a thing the Lord Treasurer in all his cleverness had never thought to guard, because men like him do not think the small and the young are worth guarding against. Princess Malin was 8 years old, and Prince Joran was 10. And like all children of a great house, they had their tutors and their nurses and their hours of lessons. And they had, as well, an hour each fine afternoon in the south garden, where they were taken to run off the day's stillness under the eye of their nurse, and always 2 guards. I had stood that garden watch many times over the years, in the rotation, and the young prince and princess knew me, in the way royal children know the steady fixtures of their world, not as a person with a life of his own, but as one of the reliable walls of the house, the tall guard by the rose arch who could be counted on to be there. Prince Joran, who at 10 was forever testing the edges of the rules, had a particular habit of trying to make the gate guards smile or speak, which is forbidden on the formal posts, and I had been the object of his campaigns many times, and once, only once, on a bitter winter day when he had brought me, gravely, a hot chestnut from his own pocket because he said no one should stand in such cold with empty hands. I had broken protocol the width of a hair and bowed my thanks. And the boy had been so delighted with his victory that he had told it to me again every time he saw me for a year. Children remember the ones who are kind to them. It is the only currency they truly bank. It was the Prince-Consort Aldric, who came to the south garden most afternoons to be with his children. Not the Queen Saralind's days were swallowed by the realm, but their father, who guarded that hour with his children as the one thing the crown could not take from him, and who came down to the garden in plain coat and walked among the roses while his son and daughter ran, and who was, for that hour, simply a father. The treasurer's wall of secretaries did not stand in the south garden. The chamberlains and stewards who had refused my letters had no post among the rose arches at 4 in the afternoon. There was only the Prince-Consort, his children, their nurse, and 2 guards of the rotation, and I was a guard of the rotation, and I had, by trading back the very shifts the treasurer's order had forced on me, arranged to stand the south garden watch on the afternoon of the 9th. I chose the 9th for a reason that I will own was not strategy, but something nearer to faith. The 9th was the day old Tomas Varon laid his sprig of rosemary on the kitchen well for the late king, because rosemary was for remembrance, and a house that forgot its dead had no foundation. Tomas could not lay it this year. He was in the gatehouse cell with his bandaged hands. So I cut a sprig of rosemary myself that morning from the herb beds behind the change house, and I laid it on the old well in the kitchen yard at dawn, for the late king and for the old man who could not. And then I put a second sprig in the breast of my tunic, against the rule, and I stood my garden watch that afternoon with it over my heart. I had no plan worth the name. A sergeant cannot simply address the Prince-Consort. To speak to a royal unbidden on watch is itself a breach that could end a man. But I had reasoned that if I could not go through the wall to the truth, I must let the truth come to me through the one door the wall did not cover, and trust that, when the moment came, the Prince-Consort Aldric, who I had to believe was the man who had ordered the honest audit, who I had to believe was good as his wife was good, would do the rest. It was thin. It was very thin. It rested on a guess about a man I had only ever watched from a post, and on the slim chance that a moment would open, and on my own readiness, when it opened, to throw 11 years of perfect discipline away in a single sentence and live or fall by it. The moment opened through a child, as such moments do. It was a fine, cold afternoon, the light already going gold and low through the bare trees, and Prince Joran and Princess Malin were running the long path between the rose arches, while their father walked behind and their nurse sat with her shawl on the stone bench. I stood at the rose arch in my full kit, eyes forward, the rosemary over my heart, every part of me at correct attention, while every part of me strained toward the walking figure of the Prince-Consort, who was perhaps 20 feet away, and might as well have been 20 miles for all that protocol allowed me to cross to him. And little Princess Malin, running, caught her shoe on a flagstone and went down hard on her hands and knees on the cold path, and burst into the sudden total tears of a child who has frightened herself. And I, without thought, without permission, in plain breach of every standing order of the garden watch, went to one knee on the stone beside her before her nurse had risen from the bench, and I said, in the low, steady voice you use on a frightened child, "There now, Your Highness. You're not hurt past mending. Sit up and let me see." It was the second order I broke in this whole affair, and like the first it was for a child in distress, and I have never been sorry for either. The princess, startled out of her crying by the tall garden guard suddenly down on the stone at her level, looked at me with her wet eyes, and her brother came running, and the nurse hurried up, and through all of it I was aware of one thing above the rest, that the Prince-Consort Aldric had stopped walking and had turned, and was watching the guard who had gone to his daughter's knee, with an expression I could not read but did not, in that moment, fear. The princess's hands were scraped and would sting but were not truly hurt, and I told her so, and I drew the sprig of rosemary from my tunic. I cannot now say why, except that it was over my heart and my hand went to it, and I gave it to her, the small gray-green sprig, and I said, because it was Tomas's saying and it was true and I needed, suddenly, to have said it aloud to someone of the house at last, "That's rosemary, Your Highness. It's for remembrance. An old man of this house lays it every year for the king who's gone, because he says a house that forgets its own has no foundation. He couldn't lay it this year, so I've brought you a piece. Mind it. It matters more than it looks." And Prince Joran, 10 years old and sharp as a blade, said, "Why couldn't the old man lay it? Is he the one they locked up for the fire? Tudor says an old servant tried to burn the kitchens. He said it the way children say the terrible easy things adults have taught them, repeating the clean story without knowing it was a lie." And I looked up past the children at the Prince-Consort Aldric, who had come close now, near enough to speak, his face grave, and I made the choice I had come to the garden to make, and I said to the boy, but for the father, "No, Your Highness. The old man didn't burn the kitchens. The old man put the fire out with his own 2 hands, and he was holding the proof of who really said it when they took him, and the proof is sewn into my coat this minute, and I have been trying for a month to bring it to someone who would hear it, and every door I tried was shut by the man who has the most to fear from it being heard." Then I rose and faced the Prince-Consort and braced for ruin and finished it. "Your Highness, I am a sergeant of your guard. I have broken protocol twice today, and I will answer for it. But before you have me taken off this post, I beg you give me 5 minutes and a closed door, because I can tell you the true cause of the scare that emptied your palace in the night, and it is not the cause your household has told you, and the man who is its true cause is closer to your treasury than to your gate. I have stood through cannon fire that frightened me less than the silence that followed." The Prince-Consort Aldric looked at me for a long moment, and I could not read him, and I prepared myself to be seized and marched off the post by the second garden guard, who I could feel had gone rigid with alarm at his sergeant's madness. The nurse had drawn the children back. The low gold light lay over the bare garden. And the Prince-Consort, at last, did a thing I have honored him for ever since. He did not call for me to be taken. He looked at the rosemary in his daughter's hand, and at the scraped knees I had knelt to, And at the Burns I could not have known he had heard about, for he had, it turned out, heard of an old storekeeper's burned palms and wondered in the quiet way of a thoughtful man how an arsonist comes by them, and he said evenly, 5 minutes. A closed door. Now. And Sergeant, if you are wasting them, you will wish you had let them take you off the post. He took me himself, with one trusted man of his own household, not a treasurer's man. I marked that, and was glad of it, to a small writing room off the garden gallery, and he closed the door with his own hand, and he said, "Speak." So I spoke. I had rehearsed it 100 times on the gate in the dark, and I gave it to him in order, plainly, the way a guard gives a report, without ornament, because the truth needs no ornament, and ornament only makes a powerful man doubt you. I told him what I had seen from the east gate on the night of the fire. The smoke smothered, not fed, the forced interior door deep in the building, the geography that made an outside intruder impossible. I told him of Tomas Varen's burned hands, and of what the old man had told me, the scrape of stone, the open door that was always locked, the shadow going up the cold corridor toward the deep house, the bright key found gleaming on the floor and clutched in an honest hand. I drew out my pocket knife and slit the lining of my own coat there in front of him, and took out the small brass key and laid it on the writing table between us. And I watched the Prince-Consort's face as he looked at it, and I saw that he knew what it was, for he was a man who had seen the muniment keys. Then I told him the rest, the part that had taken a month and cost a good man his post. I told him of the ash I had sifted in the cold corridor, and the unburned corners that read accounts and tithes and disbursement. I told him of Edred Mott and the day books and the pattern that flowed all one way, the coal let too dear, the river wall paid for twice, and then I told him of the foundling house in the southern town, of 50 children the Queen believed she fed who were 5, and I watched the Prince-Consort Aldric's face change at that, watched something cold and terrible come into it. Because he was a father in a garden full of his own running children, and the thought of orphaned children robbed in his wife's good name struck him exactly where I had known. If he were the man I hoped, it would strike. I told him of Garrick Stoll the locksmith, who had cut the brass key 3 weeks before the fire from a wax pattern brought by a tall man in a long dark coat with a green-stoned ring, and who had kept the wax and would swear to it. And I told him last, the thing I had reasoned on the dark road, that a man does not have a muniment key cut 3 weeks in advance to burn a record on impulse, that the fire was planned, that something 3 weeks before had frightened the thief into destroying his proof, and that the only thing that could frighten a Lord Treasurer so was the approach of an honest audit ordered from above him. 3 weeks before the fire, I said, did your Highness set in motion a true examination of the household accounts? The Prince-Consort had gone very still. I did, he said quietly. I told 3 men. The matter was to be opened after the turn of the year. He looked at the brass key on the table as though it were a live coal. One of the 3 men I told was the Lord Treasurer himself. It is his office. I could not examine it without his knowledge. I told Ferrum and Vane that the Crown's accounts would be reviewed by an independent hand in the new year. His jaw set. 3 weeks before the fire. Then he knew, I said, that an honest hand was coming for the ledgers that would convict him, and he moved first. He had the key cut. He learned the route through the cold corridor. He chose his night. He went down in the dark to take and burn the muniment ledgers. The central record that, read against Master Mott's day books, would have proved the theft beyond any denying. And he was nearly finished when an old man's candle came around the door, and he fled up the corridor and dropped his key, and the old man saved your service range and was caught holding the one thing that could undo it all. And when the watch took the old man, the Lord Treasurer saw the gift the knight had handed him, and he let the clean story harden, and when a sergeant of your guard would not let it harden, he tried to buy that sergeant and banish him, and when that failed he turned out the auditor's assistant who could read the ledgers, to frighten every honest clerk in your house into silence. He is this hour certain that he has won, that the proof is ash, the witnesses scattered, and the inconvenient sergeant beaten. He does not know that the old man's hand closed on his key. He does not know the locksmith kept the wax. He does not know I am in this room. I have wondered since whether I said too much, whether I should have given the great man only the bones and let him send for proofs in his own time. But I think now I was right to give it whole, because a powerful man hearing such a charge against another powerful man needs more than a key on a table. He needs to see the whole shape of it at once, so that the shape itself convinces, every part bearing out every other part, the smothered fire and the burned hands and the geography and the ash and the day books and the wax, and the 3 weeks all locking together into a single thing that cannot be argued into pieces. And I watched the Prince-Consort Aldric assemble it behind his eyes, fact onto fact, and I watched the last doubt go out of him, and what came into his face in its place was not the hot fury I had half feared and half hoped for. It was something colder and far more dangerous to Faramond Vane, the still, controlled, absolute anger of a quiet man who has been deceived in his own house, in his wife's good name, at the expense of children, by a man he had trusted and dined with and believed. "You have a key," he said at last, very low. "You have a locksmith with the wax. You have an auditor's man with the day books turned out, you say, but findable. You have an old man with burned hands and the truth in his mouth. You have the ash if it has not been cleared." He looked up at me. "What you do not have, Sergeant, is the one thing that would put it past every denial. Vane will say the key is not his. He will say the locksmith lies or mistakes him. He will say Mott's books are a dismissed man's revenge. He will say a sergeant overreaches. He is clever and he is high, and clever high men have talked their way out of more than this." A pause. "Unless we give him a thing he cannot talk his way out of, unless we let him do, in front of witnesses he cannot dismiss, the very thing only the guilty man would do." And the Prince-Consort Aldric, who I had come to the garden hoping was good, showed me in that moment that he was also something I had not dared hope, that he was clever too, clever enough to catch a clever man. And he told me what we would do, and it was a thing only a guard standing his ordinary post could make possible, and I understood that my month of restraint had been the long, quiet setup, and that the turn, when it came, would come at the gate. The Prince-Consort's plan was simple, as the best plans are, and it turned on the one truth Faramond Vane did not possess, that his lost key had been found. So we would let him learn that it had, but in a way of our choosing, that would drive him not to the truth but to the trap. It was given out quietly, through the very household channels that served the treasurer, that the matter of the fire was at last to be closed. The old storekeeper Varin, it was let be known, would be formally charged within the week. But first, on the Prince-Consort's order, the cold corridor was to be opened and searched one final time, and the recovered evidence brought up and laid before the Prince-Consort in the council chamber on the night of the closing, so that the charge might be founded on a proper examination of the scene. And it was added, as if in passing, by a clerk who did not know he was a fisherman's hook, that the search had already turned up a small brass key, found in the corridor ash, the make of which the Prince-Consort wishes explained before he signs the charge. A small brass key, found in the corridor, to be explained before the Prince-Consort. There was no surer bait in the world for the one man who knew exactly whose key it was, and exactly what it would explain if the wrong eye studied it. Faramond Vane could not let that key reach a careful examination in the Prince-Consort's hands. He could not denounce it without revealing he knew of it. He had to get to it, to see it, to take it, to swap it for a harmless key or destroy it outright before the council met. And to do that, he would have to go himself in the night to where the recovered evidence was held, exactly as he had gone himself in the night to burn the ledgers, because a man does not trust such a thing to a servant. The proud and the guilty believe their own hands are the only safe hands. It is how they are caught. The recovered evidence, the brass key, which by now was a plain key of no account that we had cut to look the part, the true one being safe with the Prince-Consort, was held, It was given out in the strong cabinet of the muniment range, behind the very locks Vane himself kept the master keys to. The trap was the room he could enter when no one else could. We did not bar the muniment range that night. We did the opposite. We left it watched. And the watch was mine. I will tell you plainly that the Prince-Consort offered me the choice. He could have set other men. But it was my month, and my key, and my old man in the cell, and he is a fair man. And so he asked me whether I wished to stand the muniment watch that night. And I said that I did. And I said it because I needed, after all of it, to be the man at the post when the truth came home, the way I had been the man at the post when the trouble first walked in. There is a symmetry in a guard's life that civilians do not understand. You stand and stand and stand through the long nothing, and the standing is not nothing. The standing is the thing, because it is the standing that puts you there when the one moment comes that all the standing was for. So on the night the council was to close the matter, I stood the muniment watch, alone, to all appearances, one guard at the end of a dark gallery before a locked door, exactly the small, unguarded-seeming opportunity a clever man would pray for. But I was not alone. In the dark of the council chamber that opened off the gallery, behind a door left a careful inch ajar, stood the Prince-Consort Aldric and 3 men he trusted utterly. His own household captain, the master of the Queen's justice, and brought up quietly that evening from the gatehouse with his bandaged hands and the surgeon's leave, old Thomas Varon, who had asked, when he understood what the night might do, to be there, so that I may see it with my own eyes, sergeant, for I have not slept since they took me, thinking the house believed me a burner of kitchens. They stood in the dark and they waited, and at the end of the gallery I stood my post and waited, and the great house slept around us, and the hours went by. He came at the deadest part of the night, the same hour he had come for the ledgers. 23 minutes past 2, I marked the chime, and the symmetry of it raised the hair on my arms. He came down the gallery in a long dark coat with the collar up, moving with the quiet certainty of a man who knows the house is his and the locks are his and the night is his. He carried a shuttered lantern and a ring of keys, and on his left hand, when the lantern's narrow light crossed it, a gold ring with a green stone. I had never, in all my service, stood so near to Fairham Vane. He was tall and silver at the temples, and his face in the lantern light was the calm, intelligent face of a man who had dined at the Crown's table for 20 years and stolen from its orphans for half of them and felt, I think, no contradiction in it at all, only the smooth conviction of the powerful that the rules are for the small. He stopped when he saw me at the post. For a heartbeat we looked at each other in the dark, the Lord Treasurer and the sergeant he had tried to buy and banish, and I saw him decide that I was only a guard, a fixture, a wall beneath his notice, which was the whole engine of the trap, that men like him cannot conceive that a wall might be watching them. "Sergeant," he said smoothly, "you may stand down. I will examine the recovered evidence myself on the Prince-Consort's behalf before tomorrow's council. The hour is irregular, I know, but the matter is delicate and I prefer it unobserved. You understand. Open the range." And there it was, the order to stand down, the order to look away, the order that was the whole of his guilt spoken aloud. For there was no lawful reason on earth for the Lord Treasurer to come alone at past 2 to take recovered evidence from a sealed room before the council that was to examine it. I looked at him, and I thought of Thomas's burned hands in the dark behind that council door, and of 50 children who were 5, and of a month of standing still beneath my fear, and I gave him the only answer my whole life had been training me to give. "No, my lord," I said, "I will not stand down, and I will not open the range. The recovered evidence stays sealed until the council, on the Prince-Consort's own order, which is the order I keep, not yours." His face did not change at once. Men like him do not believe, at first, that a wall has refused them. "You will open it," he said, and the smoothness had gone a degree colder, "or you will spend what remains of your service regretting that you stood in my way at 2 in the morning over a matter that does not concern you. I am the Lord Treasurer of this household. Step aside." "The matter concerns me, my lord," I said, "because I was at the east gate the night of the fire, and I saw the smoke smothered and not fed, and I knew the man you let them blame. And because I am the one who picked your key up out of the gutter where it fell from his burned hand. The real one, my lord, not the one in that room. The real one, the one Garrick stole cut for you 3 weeks before the fire from a wax pattern you brought him in your own long coat with that ring on your hand, the wax he kept. You came tonight to take a key you thought was the only proof against you. You are too late. The proof has been in the Prince-Consort's keeping for a week. There is nothing in that room but the bait you have just swallowed." I watched the certainty go out of Faramond Vane's face. It did not go all at once. It went the way a great building goes when the ground beneath it gives a stillness first, a held breath, and then the slow, terrible understanding moving through every part of him that the thing he had stood on for years was no longer there. The lantern shook very slightly in his hand, and he did what cornered clever men do in their last moment, which is to reach even then for the smooth lie. "You are mad," he began. "A guard's invention." "There is no I came only to." He came only to take the recovered evidence in the dead of night, alone, before the council that ordered it sealed. The council door swung wide, and the Prince-Consort Aldric stepped out of the dark into the gallery, and the smoothness died on Faramond Vane's lips, because there are some men a lie will not work on, and the one you have robbed in his own house is chief among them. The Prince-Consort came down the gallery slowly, and behind him came his household captain, and the master of the Queen's justice, and last, slow on his salved feet, his bandaged hands held before him like a man carrying something fragile, old Tomas Varin, who looked at the Lord Treasurer of the household for a long moment and did not say a word, and whose silence was louder than any accusation. "You will not speak, Faramond," the Prince-Consort said, and his voice was the quiet I had heard in the writing room, the still controlled anger that is so much worse than shouting. "You have spoken enough this past month. I have heard your clean story, and I have very nearly signed a charge upon it. Now you will be silent and you will listen, while I tell you what I know, and then you will answer me, and God help you if you reach again for a lie, because every door behind which you might hide one is already shut." He stopped a pace from the man, and I saw that he had the real brass key in his hand, and he held it up so the lantern caught it. 3 weeks before the fire, I told 3 men that the Crown's accounts would be examined by an honest hand. One of those 3 men had a key cut to the muniment cabinets, and went down into the cold corridor in the night to burn the ledgers that examination would have read. He set a fire against the old beams of my house, with my children sleeping above it. He let an innocent man of 40 years' service be taken in his place, and would have let him hang. He robbed the foundling house in the southern town that my wife founded with her own hand, and starved children to fatten himself in her good name. And when one guard of this house would not take the easy lie, that man tried to buy him, and banish him, and turned a faithful old auditor out into the street to silence him. The Prince-Consort's hand closed around the key. "I demand to know, Faramond, and you will tell me here now in front of these witnesses by what right and for how long and where the money went and who else in my house knew. You will give me the truth you have spent a month burning. You owe it to that old man's hands. You owe it to 50 children. Speak." And Faramond Vane, Lord Treasurer of the household, looked from the key to the Prince-Consort to the silent old man with the bandaged hands, and the thing that I had watched build behind his calm, intelligent face all this time finally broke. And he did not speak, he could not, but his legs gave under him, and he sat down hard upon the cold stone of the gallery floor. A tall man in a long dark coat folded suddenly small, and that collapse was his confession more complete than any words. And every man in that gallery knew it. What followed I will tell briefly, because the long, slow grinding of justice is not the part that matters. The turn is the part that matters, and the turn had come. Faramond Vane was taken that night quietly, with no bell and no alarm, by the Prince-Consort's own captain, and held, and in the days after, when he understood at last that the proofs were whole, and the wax was kept and the day books found and the locksmith ready to swear. He gave it all up, the whole long architecture of his theft, the coal and the river wall and the false company and the foundling money, 8 years of it, and the 2 under-clerks he had drawn into it with money and fear. The master of the Queen's justice followed every thread. The stolen wealth that could be recovered was recovered. And the foundling house in the southern town received, that very quarter, not the tenth it had been starved on, but the whole of what the good Queen had always believed it was receiving, and more, paid out of Vane's forfeited estate by the Prince-Consort's order, so that 50 children who had been 5 were 50 again, and never knew how near they had come to being forgotten. Edred Mont was brought back. The Prince-Consort sent for him himself. The dry, precise auditor's assistant turned out with his life in 2 boxes on a handcart, and restored him not to his old post, but to a better one, keeper of the Crown's accounts, with the charge to build the honest examination that Vane had feared into a thing that ran every year, in the open forever, so that no future treasurer could bleed the Crown in the dark for 2 years before a single faithful man dared ask the question. Edred took the post, and he wept, I am told, when he was given it, the only time anyone had seen him do so, and he said that he had not loved the accounts in vain after all. And Thomas Varin. The old man was cleared that same night fully, before he ever slept again under a roof that doubted him. The Prince-Consort would not let it wait for the morning's formality. He took the old man's bandaged hands in his own, there in the gallery, and he thanked him, the Prince-Consort of the realm, thanking the underkeeper of the kitchen stores for saving his house, and for keeping, even in a cell, even believing himself doomed, the simple honesty that had closed his ruined hand around a stranger's key because it did not belong on that floor. You saved my house twice over, the Prince-Consort told him. Once from the fire and once from the lie. And he ordered that Thomas Varin be restored to his place with full honor, and his burns tended by the Queen's own surgeon. And this was the Queen's doing when she heard the whole of it the next day. For Queen Saralind wept at the foundling children and went white at how near her good name had come to being made a thief's mask. That on every 9th of the month, for as long as he wished it, old Thomas should lay his sprig of rosemary on the kitchen well not alone, but with a guard of honor beside him. Because a house that forgets its own has no foundation, and this house would not forget again. As for me, I returned to my post. I want to end there because that is where a guard's story should end, at the post with the trouble answered, and the house quiet and the man back at his gate. The Prince-Consort offered me advancement, a captaincy, a place of honor away from the cold of the gate, and I thanked him, and I asked instead to keep my post at the east gate, because it was mine, and because I had learned something standing it that I did not want to unlearn in a warmer room. He understood. He is a man who understands such things. But he did one thing I could not refuse, and it is the only honor of that whole month that I wear where it can be seen. He took from his own coat a small plain medal of the household, not a grand jeweled order, but the quiet kind a man gives when the giving matters more than the glitter, and he pinned it to my tunic with his own hand, and he said low, so only I could hear it, for the man who would not take the easy answer, "Stand your gate, sergeant. I sleep better knowing the wall is watching." So I stand it still, the east gate of Harrowgate Palace, in the deep of the night, through the long hours when nothing happens, because the standing is the thing, and the standing is what puts a man where he must be when at last something does. People think the guard's power is in the moment he finally moves. It is not. His power is in all the moments he does not, the held hand, the kept silence, the patient refusal to take the loud, easy answer the bell hands you in the dark. Restraint is not weakness. Vigilance is not idleness. They are the quiet keeping of a faith, night after night, by men no one is watching, so that on the one night it matters there is someone at the post who notices the smoke is being smothered and not fed, and who will not stand down, and who will not look away, and who will carry a small true thing patiently through a month of fear until the house is ready to hear it. The bell that first night sounded like a wound opening in the dark. I have thought since that I was wrong about that. A bell only tells the house to be afraid. It was never the bell that healed the wound. It was the silence after and the man who knew what to do with it. I laid the rosemary on the well myself this last night beside old Tomas and his guard of honor. It is for remembrance. It matters more than it looks.